Hello and welcome to our webinar. Today's topic, Fedwire Funds Service ISO 20022 Implementation Overview. I'm Jean Rourke from the Center for Learning Innovation at the St. Louis Fed, and I'll be your facilitator. Let me introduce our speaker. She is Gina Russo. Gina is Assistant Vice President of Payment Product Management for the Federal Reserve System. And before turning our call over to Gina, I'd like to run through a couple of call logistics. So I am on slide 2. If you haven't joined us through the webinar yet, click on the link you received after registering. For the best webinar experience, use the FAQ document, which can be found using the Materials button in the webinar player page. I'll highlight a few important notes for you. You can listen to the audio through your PC speakers or through the phone. If you use the phone option, slides will not sync with audio unless you change your settings. You can do this by selecting the gray gear located in the upper right corner of the slide window, just above the presentation. From there, you should see a few options in the Media Chooser. You should select the phone option. You can expand the size of the slides. To do this, use the Maximize button in the upper right corner of the slide window located on the webinar player page. And if you'd like a PDF version of today's presentation, you can access it using the Materials button. We'll be taking your questions at the end of our presentation, but you can send them in anytime during our call. If you've joined us via webinar, just click the Ask Question button, and we'll get your questions queued up for our presenter today. And with that, it is now my pleasure to turn our call over to Gina Russo.
Thank you, Jean. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. As Jean mentioned, we're going to be providing you an overview of the ISO implementation for the Fedwire Funds Service. And the agenda on slide 3, we're going to be covering a quick overview of what ISO 20022 is. We're going to talk about why the Federal Reserve banks are adopting ISO 20022 messages for the Fedwire Funds Service. We will go over the scope of the implementation. We'll talk about how we will implement ISO 20022 messages for Fedwire. We'll talk about the timing of the implementation and what Fedwire participants will need to do to prepare for the implementation. And then finally, we'll close with some information on where you can find additional information, including registering for future upcoming educational sessions. And we'll turn to the next slide. So just to give you an overview of what ISO is, in case there are any folks on the call that are not familiar with ISO. So ISO is the International Organization for Standardization. It's a network of national standards bodies that develop international standards. And ISO publishes standards for a broad range of industries. The U.S. is a member and contributor to ISO standards for the financial industry through the Accredited Standards Committee X9 Financial Industry Standards. Moving on to the next slide. So what is ISO 20022? So as I mentioned on the prior slide that ISO publishes standards for a broad range of industry, well, the standards related to financial messaging are known as ISO 20022. And there are standards to support payments, securities, trade, card, and FX. So the ISO 20022 messages for payments are the ones that are going to be implemented for the Fedwire Funds Service. And ISO messages contain a large amount of data, or rich data as they're often called. They're based on a common data dictionary that can support the end-to-end payment message flow as shown here on slide 5. So there's a set of messages to support the payment initiation from the corporate to the bank space. Then there are interbank settlement messages that support the bank-to-bank, and largely these are the messages that will be used for the Fedwire Funds Service. And then there are a set of cash management messages from the bank to the corporate. And we will actually, for the Fedwire implementation, we'll be using one message that's in the payment initiation space. As I mentioned, the majority of the messages that we use will be those in the interbank settlement space, but there are also some messages in the cash management space that we'll use as well. Moving on to the next slide. So this slide shows an example of what the ISO 20022 format looks like. And we wanted to just provide a very simple example showing the address fields that are in the proprietary Fedwire message format today. That's shown in the first column. And you'll see that in Fedwire, we basically just have free text address lines. There's 3 lines, and you could put up to 35 characters in each line. And we really don't have any other requirements beyond that. And so it could just carry free text information. However, in the ISO 20022 format that you'll see in the second column, you'll see that it has very discrete structured fields for different components of the address information. So the postal address field, which is an ISO field, it has an address type, a department, a sub-department, a street number, a building number, postal code, town name, country subdivision, which would be a state, and then a country code. And the benefit of the structured address fields is it could improve compliance screening, because right now when banks have to screen messages, they have to look amongst free text fields, where when we move to ISO, the address will be contained into discrete data elements, which will make compliance screening and even data analysis easier, especially something like a country code. It would be much easier to screen messages for specific countries. So moving on to the next slide. So on this slide, we just want to give you an overview of why the Fed has decided to adopt ISO messages for the Fedwire Funds Service. And this is really a strategic initiative in support of Strategy 4 of our strategies for improving the U.S. payment system paper, where Strategy 4 talks about aligning the Fedwire message format with a global standard that can improve payment processing efficiency and promote interoperability among high-value payment systems around the world. So this effort is really a strategic initiative to modernize our proprietary message format and align it with a global standard, as other high-value payment systems around the world are also adopting the standard. Moving on to the next slide. So in terms of the scope of our implementation, we have decided that we are going to adopt ISO messages for everything in the Fedwire Funds Service. So it's all inputs and outputs of our service. It includes all message types, all inquiries, and all reports. So really, essentially, we're taking our entire proprietary format that supports the Fedwire Funds Service, and we are migrating it to ISO 20022 messages. Moving on to the next slide. So in terms of the implementation approach, we're going to be implementing ISO 20022 messages in 3 phases. And the first phase is really changes that we're making to our legacy proprietary format. It's really a preparation phase for the future phases. So in this phase, we're going to be doing a big bang implementation. So we're going to be cutting over all of our customers on the same day. where we're making changes to our legacy format that will align our format with comparable changes that SWIFT is making to MT messages for their originator and beneficiary fields. So that's one part of the changes we're making here. But we're also making additional changes that are going to simplify and prepare us for the ISO 20022 implementation in Phase 2 and Phase 3. So that will be the initial phase of our implementation. I'll talk about the timing of that in a moment. In Phase 2, we're calling this our like-for-like phase, because here what we're going to be doing is we're going to migrate our customers in waves over an 18-month period to send and receive ISO messages that will have fields and character lengths that are comparable to our legacy format. So even though as banks cut over, they will cut over to send and receive ISO. It'll be the ISO 20022 format, but it will be limited to the types of fields and character lengths that we support today, which is why we're calling it our like-for-like phase. So during this phase, because we're not cutting the banks over all on the same date, we're going to be doing it over an 18-month period. There will be a need for the Fed to translate messages that come in. So as a customer cuts over to send and receive ISO, they won't have to figure out who can receive the ISO format. Rather, the Fed will figure that out for them. So a bank, when they cut over to send and receive ISO, they'll just start sending ISO messages to any receivers. The Fed will get the message. We will, if needed, we will convert that to the legacy format to deliver to receivers who have not yet cut over to ISO. But if a bank is sending it to another bank that has also cut over, the message will then just flow in the ISO format to the receiver. And because the translation that we have to do in the middle, it's necessary for us to have this like-for-like phase. And the reason that we chose to do a phased implementation is because of the large customer base that we support for Fedwire. It was just too risky for us to cut over everyone in a big bang approach to the ISO messages. So this phased approach will reduce risk, and one of the benefits of it is it will allow banks, if a bank cuts over to send and receive ISO and they have a problem and they need to cut back to the legacy format, they will be able to do so without impacting the rest of the market. Another aspect of this implementation of this phase 2 is that even though in this phase banks will not be able to send any enhancements, what we are going to be doing as we're testing with customers to prepare them for the phase 2 migration, they will have to demonstrate their ability to receive full enhanced ISO messages in our test environment. And the reason for that is that once they can demonstrate their ability to receive full ISO messages, it's really to help us prepare for phase 3 when we allow banks to start sending ISO messages with enhancements. So again, in phase 2, customers will just migrate to sending and receiving the like-for-like version of ISO. They will demonstrate their ability to receive the full ISO, but only in the test environment. And then in phase 3, the Fed will then enable everyone in a big bang approach, so everyone will be enabled on the same day to send ISO messages with enhancements. And all of the enhancements, so when we talk about enhancements, we mean new fields. As an example, there'll be some new additional parties, like an ultimate debtor, an ultimate creditor. Banks will be able to include up to 3 intermediaries. And all of this is being done to improve the transparency of the payment. There'll be a purpose code field and some additional fields in the payment message, but they'll all be optional. But banks will not be able to start sending these optional fields until phase 3. So moving on to the next slide. So this slide talks about the timing for these different phases. The only date that we can announce at this time is the date for phase 1, where this is our legacy format changes to prepare us for ISO, and it's also the changes that we're making to align with SWIFT. And so we're aligning this implementation with the implementation date for the SWIFT changes, which is November 23rd of 2020. So essentially 3 years from now. So that is phase 1. We know that we're going to put the software changes in our customer test environment. We call it the DIT, the Depository Institution Test Environment. We'll be moving those changes in 9 months prior. And there'll be further announcements once we get closer to this, but this is essentially the high-level timeline. Then for phase 2, as I mentioned earlier, we know that this phase is going to last for 18 months. We have not yet announced the date of when phase 1 or phase 2 will begin, but basically phase 2 is going to end 18 months after phase 2 begins. Then what we plan to do is once we've converted all of our customers in phase 2, we want to have a stability period of 3 months where everyone is sending and receiving in the ISO format, and no one is having problems, and no one has to migrate back to the proprietary format. And then once we feel comfortable that everyone is sending and receiving ISO with no issues, we will officially sunset our legacy format, and then we will activate phase 3. So basically, phase 3 is going to be enabled 3 months after phase 2 ends. And we are planning to announce the dates for all 3 phases by the end of the year. If not sooner, if we can announce it sooner, we will. But definitely by the end of the year, we will be announcing the official dates for all 3 phases. Turning to the next slide. So I'm sure many of you on the call are wondering, well, what does this mean to me, and what do I have to do to prepare for these changes? Because as you might imagine, this is a massive change, and really the extent of your preparation will really depend on how much technology you have integrated into the processing of your Fedwire messages. And also it will depend on the degree to which you do your own internal software development, or if you rely on service providers or vendors to provide your interface to Fedwire. So that's the first thing you'll have to look at is, do you use vendors? Do you use a service provider? Do you do your own internal development? If you do your own internal development, then the impact, of course, is going to be greater on you because you're going to have to make all the changes yourself rather than relying on a vendor to do it for you and then upgrading to a vendor's, new software. So in terms of vendors, the Fed is planning to work directly with service providers and software vendors that provide software to interface with the FedLine Direct Access solution, because we know that many banks that use our FedLine Direct electronic access to access Fedwire. We know many banks use a software vendor to provide that interface, and other banks also even use a service provider to, they use their system to initiate their Fedwire transactions. So we're working directly with all of those vendors, and really for those type of customers, you would then need to work with your vendor or software provider to upgrade to their latest version of their payment application that will support these changes. We're also working with known software vendors that provide software that helps banks that are Fedline Advantage customers that use the Fed Payments Manager Funds application to import their messages or export their outgoing messages from FPM. We're working with those vendors to provide that import-export functionality. And what we'll be doing is we'll be sending communications to all of our customers to explain to them, and to identify the vendors that we are working with, and letting them know if there's vendors that they are working with that are not on our list, to please let us know who they're working with so that we could get the word out to all of the vendors that need to be involved to make these changes. If you go to the next slide, this slide breaks it out into the different types of access to the Fedwire Funds Service. So the first row here is talking about, again, the Fedline Direct Access solution, or those that use the import-export feature of the Fed Payments Manager Funds application. So the biggest impact of these changes will be on those customers, because those customers, they're either going to have to make the changes themselves if they do their own software development, or they're going to have to work with their vendors or service providers to ensure that they make the changes. And so we're going to be sharing the format specification documents with these customers and their vendors, and we'll talk about how we're going to do that on the next slide. But really, those customers are the ones that have the biggest impact. The next row talks about customers that use the Fed Payments Manager application, but they just manually key in their transactions to the Fed Payments Manager screens. So for those customers, the Fed is going to make all the changes for you. So we're going to update all the screens, and we'll be providing training and documentation to help you learn what the new screens look like and navigate through the new screens. And so for those customers, they're really just going to have to get used to the new look and feel of the screens and become familiar with the new fields and any enhanced features we implement. So for those customers, it's more of a training exercise and an education exercise. In terms of actual software development, there's really nothing that they would need to do. And then for the last category of customers, those are our smaller customers that don't send a lot of Fedwire Funds transactions, and they use our offline telephone service. So for those customers, of course, we're going to be making the changes to support our offline service, but these customers may have to change their process for how they submit they may have to learn about, new fields that they're going to have to instruct when they call in their offline wires. There may be new field names, or there may be brand new fields that they don't have today. So again, for them, it's really more of an educational change for them, a training and education. So again, the biggest change is on that first category of customers, Fedline Direct and the Fed Payments Manager import-export customers. Then if you turn to the next slide. So this slide talks about where you can find information on all of the documentation that is going to support these changes, because there is going to be quite a bit of documentation that really the technical people, either software developers or the technical folks within the banks, are going to have to become familiar with in order to make the changes. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be leveraging Swift's My Standards browser-based application to provide our documentation. So we're not making the documentation publicly available. It will be posted to a private group called the Federal Reserve Bank's group on the My Standards application. And what anyone that needs the documentation, the very first thing they'll have to do is they'll have to just register on SWIFT.com, and then they'll have to go to the My Standards page and then request access to our private page. And we're going to be sending out information to explain to customers how to sign up for My Standards. But essentially, they're going to, authorize customers through their end user authorization contacts. We're going to be communicating with them to tell us who needs access, and then we're going to be contacting everyone that needs access to sign them up for My Standards. And then once they're signed up, they'll be able to go to the Federal Reserve Bank page and then see the documentation right there within the tool. So we're going to be sharing documentation for all three phases. The very first phase, our phase one, the documentation is going to look very much like the documentation we have today. In our Fedwire Application Interface Manual, our FAME document, the version of these changes is going to be version 4.0, and this will just be a PDF document that we'll be posting to My Standards. And we're also going to be posting a high-level scope document that highlights all the changes. So those two documents will be posted in final form to My Standards in November of this year. So essentially for this release, we're giving 3 full years notice with the documentation. So again, that will be November of this year. We will be contacting all of our customers and sending emails out to onboard you to My Standards so that by November you will be able to access this documentation. And again, if you're a Fedline Advantage customer and you're just manually entering wires into the screens, or you're an offline customer, you really don't need this documentation. It's very technical, and it's really meant for software developers. Then the Phase 2 and Phase 3 documents. So there's a lot more documentation here. So we're categorizing it in 3 different categories. We have mapping spreadsheets. So there's going to be 2 Excel spreadsheets that map our legacy format to the ISO messages, and it will show you field by field that, here's the message in our proprietary format today, and here's how it maps to ISO. And it goes line by line, and it's just simply an Excel spreadsheet. The next set of documents are called usage guidelines, and that's really ISO 20022 terminology. They call them usage guidelines. And there's really a separate guideline for each ISO message that we're implementing. In fact, some of the ISO messages, because we're using them for different purposes, there'll be multiple usage guidelines for the same ISO message. But essentially, there's going to be a set of 24 different usage guideline documents. But even though there's 24 in total, 20 of these documents will support each phase. So the Phase 2 will be supported by 20 usage guidelines, and then Phase 3 will also be supported by 20 guidelines, and we're essentially just taking 4 of the guidelines from Phase 2, and we're replacing them with a new 4 new guidelines in Phase 3. So in total, overall, there's 24 documents. And these documents basically explain how each ISO 20022 field will be used in Fedwire. As an example, there will be a separate guideline for the ISO message called the PAX 008. That is the ISO message that will be used for customer transfers. So there will be a guideline that explains, for the PAX 008 message for a customer transfer, here are all the fields that are allowed, here's the field lengths, here's the description of the fields, here's any edits that we're doing on the fields, and so that will be contained in its own usage guideline. And similarly, there will be a separate guideline then for the bank transfer message. And then the drawdown message will have its own guideline, and so on and so forth. So right now, today, everything in Fedwire is contained in one big document. But the way it works in ISO, they'll be in separate documents. And when you log into My Standards, you'll see how it works. It's more like you can click on the fields and they'll expand and show you different information. You could also download it to create a PDF document as well, or you could put it in a Excel spreadsheet, or you can actually create an XML schema. So you'll see how the tool works once you are onboarded. And again, the technical folks are really the ones that need to be able to gain access to these documents and become familiar with the My Standards tool. The other document that we're going to be posting there will be just a PDF document, and we're calling this our implementation rulebook. It will provide an overview of our implementation. It'll show message flow diagrams to show you how the ISO messages will be used to facilitate different types of transactions. And then we're also going to include in there some general rules and best practices. So this will be more of like a traditional, PDF document. So we're planning to post a draft set of all of these documents for Phase 2 and 3. They will be posted by December of this year, and then we'll be providing our customers and vendors several months to provide comments to the documents or ask questions. We will be having a series of education webinars and in-person workshops for banks and vendors to come together and ask us questions. And so I'll be sharing information about those sessions in a little bit. But we then plan to finalize the documents by June of next year, when they would be published in final form on My Standards at that time. So turning to the next slide. So where can you find more information? And some of you may have seen this page before. Last year we created a resource center for adoption of ISO 20022 on our Fed Payments Improvement website. So we have a dedicated page there where you can find all the latest information, including these recorded webinars. There's webinars that we've done in the past. You can download them. They're still posted there. This webinar today will be posted there, and you can listen to the recording as well as see the slide deck. And we also have information on this page about ACH efforts related to ISO 20022, so you can see what's going on in ACH as well. Turning to the next slide. So this slide talks about future educational opportunities, and we have the link of where you can register for these future sessions. So our next session is on November 9th. It will be a webinar similar to today. In that webinar, we'll be focusing on the changes related to Phase 1, so the FAME 4.0 changes to our legacy format. So we'll be providing an overview of all of the changes we're making and explaining why we're making the changes. And really the audience for this webinar should be product managers, business contacts, and technical contacts, including your application development, business analyst, quality assurance leads. So those are the types of people that should attend this webinar, because we'll be going into a lot more of the details of the scope of the FAME 4.0 release. And so this webinar will be November 9th. It'll be recorded, so if you miss the webinar, you'll have an opportunity to still download it from the Fed Payments Improvement website. And then what we're also going to do as a follow-up to this webinar is we're going to host a future drop-in call in the first quarter of next year, where we will allow, it'll give people a chance to digest the information from the webinar or take it back to the relevant contacts in your organizations or at your software vendors, and we'll have this drop-in call where we could address any questions. So more to come on the specific date for the drop-in call, but it will be in the first quarter of next year. Then also in next year, we're going to have additional sessions for Phase 2 and Phase 3. So the intermediate session for Phase 2 and Phase 3, here's where we're going to be reviewing the scope of Phase 2 and 3, and we're going to really be showing you the usage guidelines, going through the rule book, the message flow diagrams. We'll be talking about our migration approach of how we're going to migrate customers over that 18-month period in Phase 2. And then we'll also do an overview of the actual enhancements that we're going to introduce in Phase 3. So this webinar, it's the same audience that is attending the Phase 1 webinar should attend this webinar as well. It'll be a recorded webinar, so you'll be able to download it after the fact. And then you'll see that we're saying that this webinar is really a prerequisite for attending the advanced session. And at the bottom of the slide here, the advanced session is really going to be these in-person, all-day sessions that we'll be hosting at 3 different Fed locations. We have not announced the dates yet. They'll be in the first quarter of 2018, but we know we're going to host a session at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. There'll be one at the Fed in Chicago and then one in San Francisco. They will be all-day in-person sessions where we will invite Fedwire participants and software vendors to come, and we'll really be doing a more roll-up-your-sleeves kind of in-depth walkthrough of the documentation, address questions, and so, those are sessions that really should be attended by the technical folks, the ones that actually need to implement these changes in your systems. So more to come. We will be providing advance notice for these sessions so that you could get them on your calendars. But again, they will all be in the first quarter of 2018. Or no, the second quarter. Sorry, these advanced sessions will be in the second quarter of 2018. So more to come there. But basically, you can routinely go and check the Fed Payments Improvement website, because that's where you'll find the latest information about our implementation. But we will be sending out communications as well directly to our Fedwire participants and software vendors. So turning to the next slide. Oh, I think that was it. Okay. So now we're ready for folks to start asking questions. We have a lot of time left, so I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Gina. And I'll just give a quick reminder to our participants. You can use the Ask Question button in the webinar tool to submit your question, and we'll get that queued up for Gina today. We do have a couple of questions that have already come in, and I will just start at the top. Is this only for international Fedwire processing?
No, it's not. It's really for domestic and cross-border payments. So everything over Fedwire today is in a proprietary format. We're going to be migrating all of that to the ISO 20022 format. So even if you just send domestic U.S. payments, you're still going to have to be able to use this new format.
Okay, thanks for that, Gina. All right, our next question. I realize Phase 2 begin date is to be determined. But do we know if Phase 2 will begin after Phase 1 ends, or could it begin while the phase is still in process?
Okay, so phase 1 we know is November of 2020. Phase 2 will begin after Phase 1 ends, and it will be some time after Phase 1 ends. And then Phase 2 is going to last for 18 months as we migrate customers in groups. So essentially what we'll be doing is we'll be covering this in the intermediate session, the Phase 2 and 3 intermediate session, a sense of what we think our migration strategy will look like. We're going to be migrating customers like maybe, one weekend we're going to migrate, these 10 customers. And then the next weekend we're going to migrate the next 10 customers. So that will happen over an 18-month period. And then so then once the 18 months are done and everyone is converted, we will have this stability period that I mentioned earlier where everyone is just sending and receiving in the ISO like-for-like format, and we're comfortable that no one needs to convert back to the legacy format. We will then sunset our legacy format and then activate Phase 3. And Phase 3 is where we'll enable banks to send the optional enhancements. So no one will be forced to send any of these new fields. Everyone must be able to receive all the new fields, though, in case someone wants to send them. But we're not making anybody send them.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Gina. Our next question. Given the multiple existing standards, what benefit does ISO 20022 provide?
So that's a good question. It's a very logical question. There are a lot of standards out there, but we know that other high-value payment systems around the world have either adopted ISO 20022 or they're making plans to adopt ISO 20022. And so over time, at least in the high-value space, banks will be harmonizing around this global standard, and it really will create efficiencies, particularly for global banks, of course, that have to communicate with other high-value systems around the world. And it should reduce the amount of mapping that has to be done between different standards. ISO 20022 can also support retail payment systems, so it can support ACH systems, although the ACH systems in the U.S. have not decided to adopt ISO for the ACH systems. But over time, it really is a strategic initiative to modernize and harmonize the format for the high-value systems around the world.
Okay, thanks for that, Gina. Our next question. Are the vendors receiving this information, or should we be inviting them on these calls?
So we are working with the vendors that we know about. So, and these really are the vendors that we know provide software to enable banks to interface with the Fedline Direct Access solution. So we know who those vendors are. We are working with them directly. And we do know about some of the vendors that provide functionality to assist with the import-export feature of the Fed Payments Manager. So we're working with them directly, too. But there may be vendors that we do not know about. And these webinars are open to software vendors. So banks, yes, you're free to invite any of your vendors to these calls. Some of them, though, may already be aware of the calls.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, our next question is regarding onboarding. I have to log into swift.com, correct? If so, I'll need to find out my organization's login information, username, password, things like that. I work at a large organization. Can anybody assist in finding my organization's SWIFT administrator?
So here on Swift.com, you really can log on with your own email address because the access to my standards is based on individual people. So on Swift.com, you just can self-select. You log in with your email address. You create an account with your email address, and then you self-select a password. So that's how you get into Swift.com. And then you can go to My Standards, and you could request access to the Federal Reserve's page. And we're going to be explaining all of this to our Fedwire participants and software vendors. So we'll be sending out communications to assist with the onboarding. And we have not done that yet. We've only onboarded banks and vendors that are participating in our format advisory group, because we are working with some of the banks and some of the vendors to help us with this detailed planning. So we do have a pilot group of banks and vendors that already have access, but we have not yet communicated to our broader customer base yet, and we will be doing that within the coming months.
Okay, thanks for that, Gina. Our next question, can you provide some of the names of specific vendors or service providers with whom you plan to work with directly?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we're actually going to be doing that in the communication that we send to customers. So we will be sending that soon. You'll be getting that.
Okay, thanks for that. Our next question. We use Fedline Advantage to access Fedwire funds to send and receive wires. We make the electronic entry on our end with our core. No vendors or developers. How much does this change affect us?
So when you say you make the electronic entry on your end with your core, it sounds like maybe you have something, an internal application that you create a file to upload or import into the Fed Payments Manager. If that is what you're doing, then you will have to make the changes. So whoever your technology people are in your organization, they're going to have to make the changes to create an import file that will align to the new message format. So if you're doing that yourself, you'll have to make the changes. But if you're using a software vendor to do that, they would be the ones that have to make the changes. And if you're a Fedline Advantage customer and you're just manually typing the wires into the Fed Payments Manager screens, there's nothing that you need to do. You'll just have to, that will be in the future attending education sessions for us to show you what the new screens look like and to educate you on the new fields. But in terms of programming anything, there won't be anything you need to do.
Okay, thanks, Gina. How can we know if the vendors you're working with includes ours? Is there a list you can share with us for us to review?
Yes, as the previous person or the previous question, we are going to be sharing that list when we send out our communication to our customers, which we haven't done yet. We will be sharing that list of the vendors we're working with, and we will be providing you a way to send us a list of vendors if they're not on this list.
Okay, thanks for that. All right, our next question. For Fedline Advantage users, will additional or upgraded equipment and software be necessary?
No. So in terms of hardware or a new VPN or new tokens or anything like that, you will not need any of that for the ISO 20022 changes. However, you will need to like as I mentioned earlier, you'll need, if you're using the import-export feature, you will have to make software changes in order to create your import file with the new format. But in terms of any hardware or equipment, there won't be any upgrades necessary. And the same for Fedline Direct customers. There's no hardware changes associated with this.
Okay, thanks for that, Gina. Another question. We manually input data. Did I understand correctly that the Fed would be updating the screens and we would have it would have minimal impact?
Yes, that's correct. So if you manually key your wires in, you could take a sigh of relief here because there's nothing you need to do other than when the time comes, we'll be probably having webinars to educate you on the new look and feel of the screens, and you may have to learn like new terminology. We may change the names for some of the fields. It'll be more of a education effort on your part, but it will not be a programming effort.
Okay, thank you for that. Next question. Would we have to update all of our recurring templates to the new ISO 20022 format?
That's a good question. I'm thinking the answer is yes, because the ISO message uses different terminology, so the field names are different, and I believe that you will have to recreate the templates.
Okay, thanks for that. This next question just wants some clarification. I just want to understand phase 1. During this phase, the Fed will go live with their change to the legacy system. Does this mean the Fed will be converting the wires to the legacy format for transmission to the financial institutions during the 18-month period? And once the financial institutions are all updated to ISO, then phase 2 will go live, meaning all financial institutions go live at once. Is this correct?
No, it's not correct. Phase 1 is, these are changes to our legacy format, and we're going to be implementing the changes in a big bang approach. So all customers will migrate on the same day. And this is how we have historically made format changes. So everyone will have to, convert on the same day. So, there's no opting in or phasing into phase 1. It's just a big bang one-day cutover. For phase 2 is where we will migrate customers in groups over an 18-month period. And we will be working with our customers to assign them to certain dates. We'll, of course, try to, pick dates that work for both, but we will be, figuring out how we're going to spread out our customer base over that 18-month period. But by the end of phase 2, every customer will have to be converted to sending and receiving the ISO format. So there's no opting out of it. This is really mandatory for everyone. The only thing that will be optional in this whole thing is in phase 3, when we basically enable all customers to send optional enhancements. That's really the only thing that's optional. So, for Fedline Advantage customers, the new fields, they'll be on the screens, but no one has to send them if they don't want to. And for Fedline Direct customers, if you don't want to make the changes to send those new fields, you don't have to. But everyone must be able to receive all these new optional fields. So I hope that clarifies things.
All right, great. Thank you, Gina. Our next question, where do we find written materials? Oh, I'm sorry. Let me start over again. In phase 2, how is the Fed determining when financial institutions will be converted?
So that's a very good question, and I don't have a good answer yet. We really need to think through how we're going to migrate customers. And, you know, we also want to talk to vendors about this because, you know, really the majority of our customer base is supported by vendors. So this is largely going to be a vendor effort where the vendors have to make all the changes, but then they have to have their customers upgrade to the latest version of the vendor software. So we have to, you know, talk with those vendors and figure out, you know, maybe a certain vendor, they may want to try to convert all of their customers in a, you know, 30-day period. And so maybe, you know, we pick a month and we would try to do all of that vendor's customers in 1 month. So that's one model we could follow. We really haven't thought through that. And so we're really going to be thinking that through more early next year.
All right. Thanks, Gina. Our next question, where do we find written materials on how this will affect wires? We mainly send domestic wires, and I'm wondering how this will be affected.
So as I mentioned earlier, the changes that we're making for all three phases impact both domestic and cross-border wires. You know, we're essentially getting rid of our proprietary format and moving to this new ISO 20022 format. So, and we will be providing information, as I mentioned earlier, on my standards. That will be all the technical information. For those of you that are just Deadline Advantage customers that manually key in your messages, there's really no need for you to review this documentation. It really will be, as I mentioned before, an education effort. And, you know, much later in the process, we will be having more webinars that really go into the details of what the new screens look like, what the fields are called, and whatnot. So more to come there, but hopefully that addressed your question. Basically, all the information that we currently have available is posted to the Fed Payments Improvement website.
Great. Thank you for that, Gina. Next question. What benefits can a financial institution expect to receive that we can pass on to our customers?
So we actually have a webinar from last year on different use cases for the benefits of the ISO 20022 format. So you can go to Fed Payments Improvement and download that webinar to hear more details. But just to try to quickly address your question, some of the benefits are in terms of, well, you're asking about for your customers. So if you choose to offer any kind of data reporting services, the ISO 20022 format enables structured fields where you could more easily provide reports to your customers to show them, you know, if they want to see, you know, show me all the messages I sent to, you know, this state or that state or this country, or you know, a certain beneficiary. It'll make it easier to provide reports, custom reports to your customers. It will also help you as a bank with your compliance screening because of the structured nature of the format. So those are some examples, but we do have a whole webinar on the different use cases available on the Fed Payments Improvement website.
All right, thanks, Gina. Our next question. Do you know if the FedLine application will be replaced, or will the changes be transparent to a user of FedLine?
Yes, the FedLine, it will not be transparent because the FedLine, let me start over. What's going to change is the Fed Payments Manager Funds application. So the look and feel of the screens will change because the ISO format uses different terminology as an example. For example, the originator party in Fedwire today is called originator, but in ISO it's called debtor. So you're going to see a new field name on the screen. And we're getting rid of the Fedwire tag numbers. So you're not going to see tag, 5,000 anymore. You'll see a new field for debtor. Well, that's actually with Phase 2 and Phase 3. For Phase 1, it's going to be our legacy format, so it's going to look very similar. However, we may have, based on the changes that we're making in Phase 1, there may be some new fields that we don't have today. There'll be a lot of things that we're getting rid of that you may see today on your Fedline Advantage screen, but you won't see when we implement Phase 1. So the Fedline won't be replaced itself. It's just the Fed Payments Manager application will change.
Okay, thank you. Our next question. Since migration wave will be Phase 2, is my understanding correct that most of the testing after the changes will be done in Phase 1?
No. So for Phase 1, you're only going to be testing Phase 1. So Phase 1 is going to be implemented in production November 2020. We'll be making the software available in our test environment 9 months prior, so that would be February, March of 2020. That's when we'll put the software in. And when you're in there testing, you're only going to be testing Phase 1. So we're going to implement Phase 1 in November 2020, and then we're going to move on to Phase 2. And we'll be then putting the software changes for Phase 2 into the DIP. So when you're testing Phase 2, you'll only be testing Phase 2. And for Phase 2, the changes are going to be available in our DIT at least 1 year in advance of when Phase 1 begins. Or Phase 2, I'm sorry. Let me say that again. The software changes to support Phase 2 will go into our DIT at least 1 year prior to when we begin the migration of customers for Phase 2.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is for clarification. Phase 1 will be a big bang to implement changes, but we as an institution will not be required to utilize until Phase 2. So is that right?
No, that's not correct. Phase 1, again, Phase 1 is their changes to our legacy format. It's a big bang. When we say big bang, it's a big bang for everyone. So everyone is going to have to cut over to our changes in our legacy format, our FAME 4.0 release, on the same day. So if you're a Fedline Direct customer, you're going to have to, make the software changes, or your vendor will, to accommodate the FAME 4.0 release on the same day, on November 23rd of 2020. If you're a Fedline Advantage customer and you're manually entering into the screens, when you log in on November 23rd of 2020, the screens will look different. So it's a big bang cutover for everyone. And there's no opting in. And as I mentioned earlier, there's really no opting in for any of this, except for Phase 3. The only opting in is that if you choose, once we enable the enhancements in Phase 3, if you choose not to send any of the new fields, you don't have to. It's optional for you to send them. That's the only thing that will be optional in this three-phased implementation.
Okay, thank you for the clarification, Gina. Okay, our next question. Will the reporting replace the Fed Analyzer reporting that is currently being used?
Yes, we will need to update the Fed Transaction Analyzer to reflect the new fields. So yes, that will need to be done for all three phases.
Okay, thank you. Our next question. Will ISO 20022 make it easier for financial institutions to get all the intermediary bank information for international wires?
Yes, so that is one of the benefits of the ISO 20022 message format. And with our Phase 3, a lot of the enhancements that we're implementing are related to additional parties in the message that are not supported today. As an example, in Phase 3, you'll be able to include an ultimate debtor, an ultimate creditor, 3 intermediary banks, an additional previous instructing bank. So it's really to increase the transparency of the payment, the end-to-end payment. And so all of these fields will be available in Phase 3. Again, they'll be optional, but they will all be available.
Okay, thanks, Gina. We've gotten a lot of great questions. We have plenty of time. We still have a couple of more questions, but I just want to remind people that you can use that Ask Question button in the webinar if you have a question you'd like to ask Gina today. All right, Gina, our next question. Has SWIFT already fully implemented ISO 20022? Additionally, once Phase 3 is complete, will this allow for direct mapping of all XML fields on cross-border payments?
So SWIFT, they are capable of carrying ISO 20022 messages over the SWIFT network. However, it's not widely available to all SWIFT participants. And I know that this is definitely an issue that needs to be addressed to ensure full interoperability of cross-border payments, particularly in the correspondent banking space, because that's how the global banks communicate with each other. They use the SWIFT MT format. So this is definitely an issue that needs to be addressed, but it has not fully been addressed yet, but we do believe that it will be addressed by the time we enable our Phase 3 enhancements release.
Okay, thank you. Will we need to upgrade software for import-export function for wires?
Yes, you will. So for any Fedline Advantage customers that use the import-export feature, either you or your vendor will have to make changes to create a new import file that includes the new fields in Phase 1, 2, or 3. So it'll have to be structured according to the message format specifications of our legacy format in Phase 1 or the ISO 20022 format in Phase 2. So for vendors, for banks that do their own software development for this import-export feature, you will have to make all these changes. For banks that use a software vendor, it's critical that you inform us of who your vendor is. Now, we will be sending out communications to our Fedline Advantage customers to collect this information, but please feel free to submit it to us, so that, just in case you're not the one that gets the communication from us, because it's critical that we know who all these vendors are.
Okay, thank you. Will the security wire eventually go through the same effort of ISO 20022 standard changes, and when?
So at this time, there are no plans at all to adopt ISO 20022 for the Fedwire Security Service. So I'm not sure if it will ever happen, but there's definitely no plans to do so in the near future. This effort right now is only for the Fedwire Funds Service.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Are the ACH ISO 20022 efforts separate from Fedwire changes, or are the changes related? For example, how does this affect ACH export-import files, if at all? Will software changes and programming be needed?
So again, this effort is just for the Fedwire Funds Service. The Fed ACH service has not announced any plans to adopt ISO for the ACH service. So the ACH payments will remain in the NACHA format.
Okay, thank you for that. Next question. Will there be a limit to the number of attendees per DFI that can attend the advanced session in Q2 of 2018? Also, can product managers be included among the audience for the advanced session?
I don't think that we'll have a hard limit. I mean, I think that we will encourage banks to, there's definitely space limitations in the different facilities where we're hosting these meetings, but we don't want to necessarily have a hard limit on the number of attendees, because we want, the whole purpose of these sessions are for the technical people to really become familiar with what the changes are and ask questions if they need to better understand the documentation. And product people are certainly welcome to come to the sessions as well.
Okay, our next question. Will there be a standard ISO format or each bank can create their own? Where does the data dictionary come into play?
So the ISO 20022 messages that we're implementing for Fedwire, they are based on the full ISO 20022 messages that are publicly available actually on the ISO 20022 website. So what we're doing is we're not implementing every single field and every single option available in the broader set of ISO messages. We're implementing a subset of that. We're implementing our own implementation of the ISO messages. And so banks aren't going to create their own format. They're going to be using our format. So we're going to be telling you, over Fedwire, if you want to send a customer transfer message, you must send the PAX 008 message in this way. And here's the fields you could use. Here's the edits. Here's the, field lengths and all that kind of thing. But, it will be based on the broader ISO 20022 message, but it will be our implementation of that message. And so banks aren't going to implement their own flavor of it. They're going to have to align to the requirements of our format. I hope that addresses the question.
All right, thank you. Our next question, will the communication you mentioned go to the parties on this call or the EUACs?
That's a very good question. So what we typically do is we have all of our communications go to authorized contacts. So those authorized contacts are the individuals listed as EUACs. And so that's who our communications will go to, especially for onboarding them to my standards. So if and what we're finding is often the EUAC doesn't necessarily always get it to the right person. So for those of you on the call, it's really important for you to know who the EUAC is at your institution. Some of you may be an EUAC, but it's important for you to coordinate with them and ensure that once we send out these communications, that they will get it to the right contacts at your organizations that need the information.
Okay, our next question. How do we need to inform you of our vendors? Is there a form?
Yes, when we send out the communication that I just mentioned, we're sending it to the EUACs. In the communication, we're listing all the vendors that we know about, and if there's a vendor that's not on the list, we will have a link to a form for you to fill out who the vendor is.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. All right, next question. Could you please explain again the difference between Phase 1 and Phase 2? Are we saying that although Fedwire Funds Service participants are expected to make changes to support ISO 20022 by end of Phase 1, they will send and receive ISO 20 messages with Fedwire only during Phase 2, the waived migration?
Okay. So Phase 1 is really Phase 1 is not ISO. Phase 1 is our legacy format. It's changes we're making to our legacy format to make the ISO migration easier. So as an example, in Phase 1, we're eliminating a lot of things that no one uses or that are used incorrectly and, things that don't make sense. We're really cleaning up our legacy format and the reason we're doing that is that when we migrate to ISO in Phase 2, it'll be a much cleaner migration. It'll be much easier to map from our legacy format to the ISO format. And so Phase 1 is all about the proprietary format, and that's it. It's not there's no ISO messages in Phase 1. It's just our legacy format. And it'll be very similar to message format changes we've made in the past. So that's Phase 1. Phase 2 is where we will migrate customers to send and receive the ISO like-for-like messages. And I think the confusion here might be that with Phase 2, when you cut over to Phase 2, you're going to send and receive ISO messages. They'll be like-for-like. There won't be any enhancements in them. But what we want to do in Phase 2 is when you're testing with us, we, the Fed, would like to send you test messages that are the full ISO message with all the enhancements. And we're going to send them to you to ensure you could receive them. But when you actually cut over in production in Phase 2, well, no one's actually going to be sending you any of these enhancements yet because we're not enabling them until Phase 3. But your ability to receive them in our test environment in Phase 2 will position you to be able to handle Phase 3. Essentially, let me try to say it. I know it is confusing. If you're an institution and you choose not to send any of the enhancements in Phase 3, you essentially could be done with your ISO implementation in Phase 2 because you're sending ISO like-for-like and you're receiving like-for-like, but you've already tested your ability to receive ISO with enhancements. So therefore, when we activate Phase 3, you're already positioned to be able to receive all the enhancements, and there's really nothing else you need to do. However, for Phase 3, if you want to start sending the ISO messages with the enhanced fields, you would have to make changes in order to support that. I hope that, send another question in if you're still confused by this, because I know it is a little confusing between Phase 2 and Phase 3. But Phase 1, I want to be very clear about Phase 1. Phase 1 is just changes to our legacy format like we've done in the past. And it's no phasing in. It's just a big bang implementation. Everyone has to make the changes at the same time.
Okay, thanks, Gina, for providing clarity there. I appreciate it. The next question, how are the upcoming enhancements to Fed Payments Manager Funds that will be implemented on October 30th related to ISO 20022, or are they related at all?
So they're not related at all to ISO 20022. The changes that we're making on October 30th, they are related to new processing options that we are implementing to allow Fedline Advantage customers to control access to the Fed Payments Manager application. They have nothing to do with ISO, and we will retain the changes that we're making to those processing options. We will retain those throughout our phased implementation for ISO, but they have no relationship at all.
Okay, thank you. Next question. You mentioned using the ISO PAX 008. I don't know if that's how you say it, but I think it's a fun way to say it. Have all the various ISO messages that the Fed will use be identified? Fed will use custom versions of the standard ISO messages.
Yes. So, in fact, in the advanced webinar, the Phase 2 and 3 advanced webinar, we will actually tell you which ISO messages we're using. And basically, what we did, and I alluded to this in answering an earlier question. So we took the full ISO 20022 message. So the full, as an example, the full PAX 008. And we basically looked at it and, essentially reduced it to what is needed on Fedwire, because we don't need every single field available in the PAX 008 on Fedwire. For example, the PAX 008 has fields that would be relevant to an ACH or batch processing system. Well, Fedwire is not a batch system. It's a RTGS system. So we don't need any fields that talk about batch stuff. So we are not including those in our implementation. So, we are customizing it to be relevant for a high-value wire transfer system. And I will also add, and I didn't cover it in this webinar, we'll actually cover it in future webinars, but I will add that in coming up with the way we have defined the ISO messages for Fedwire, we are aligning it to global market practices that other high-value systems around the world will be using in their ISO implementations. So we are trying to align to common implementations so that the ISO implementation for Fedwire will look similar to the ISO implementation for chips or other high-value systems around the world. It won't be identical because, again, our systems are not identical, but it will look very similar.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, do we need to refer any of the Do we need to refer to any of the previous ISO standards to prepare for ISO 20022?
No, we will be implementing the latest version, and I can't remember the version number of it, but we will be implementing that latest version of ISO.
Okay, thank you. For Fedline Advantage, with the import-export software programming changes will be needed in Phase 1, but will additional programming be needed for Phase 2, or will we have the info available for both phases so we can make updates to the import and export coding?
So you will have to make changes in Phase 1 because, again, the Phase 1 import-export, the import file, it will be our FAME 4.0 format with all the Fedwire legacy tags and data elements and delimiters and all that kind of stuff. So that's what you'll need to do for Phase 1. But then when we go to phase 2, well, that's when your import file will need to include the ISO fields, so the ISO tags and data elements and whatnot. So you will have to make changes twice. So you'll have to make changes for phase 1 and then changes again for phase 2.
All right, thanks for that, Gina. We just have one question left. We submitted vendor information in March of 2017. Can we expect that these vendors are already on the list?
Yes, we did send out a communication earlier this year, and we did ask the Fedline Advantage customers to, or Fedline Direct actually, to submit their vendor information. Many of you did do that, but there's definitely some gaps there. So I don't believe that we have all of the vendors identified. But anyone that filled out that form back in March, we have that information. In fact, that's how we learned about some of these import-export vendors that are not our Fedline Direct vendors. They just do the import-export, and we have reached out to them, and we're communicating with them to give them access to the documentation.
Okay, Gina, I'm just going to refresh our inbox here and see if we get any additional questions. Did you have any closing remarks before I officially close out our webinar today?
Just that I thank everyone for their attention. I think there were a lot of good questions. I think it's clear that there is some confusion on the different phases. So I think maybe in a future webinar, maybe there's a way for us to better clarify the differences between the phases. So I will take that back and try to make that more clear. And this is a multi-year implementation, and we will be trying to communicate with customers and vendors as much as possible to ensure awareness and to help our customers prepare for this implementation. And we encourage you to attend the future webinars and the in-person sessions. As we mentioned earlier, all these webinars will be recorded. So if you don't have an opportunity to attend on that particular date and time, you can always download it later. You could also, if there's others in your organization that need the information, you could also make it available to them as well. So again, just thank you everyone for your time and attention today.
Okay, well, Gina, while you were providing closing remarks, we did get one more question. Do you have time to take that?
Sure.
Okay. The question is, what's the advantages of ISO 20022 when talking about cybersecurity?
What are the advantages? I'm not sure how to address this question.
Well, we have their contact information. Maybe we can think on it and get back to that person.
Okay, that would be great.
All right, that sounds good. Well, I appreciate you providing some closing remarks, and I want to thank you, Gina, for your time and expertise today, and I'd like to thank our participants for joining us. This concludes today's webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day.